Good afternoon. I'd like to present our new guests at the discussion panel, Sacred and Profane, Jan Tarnas, Manick Govinda, Agnieszka Kolek, and Cynthia Harlow, sorry. Will be Manick and Agnieszka will lead the show. I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. I'll just make sure I get the mic right. Hello, thank you, Beata, for welcoming us. And this is the second of our discussions on a series called Culture Tensions, which myself and Agnieszka Kolek has co-curated. So this debate on the sacred and the profane feels very topical. When we planned this in December, the world was different. The world has changed with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and that is a spectre that I think is very much in the foreground, as well as the backdrop of this debate. But I'm not going to say too much right now because we've got four amazing speakers, panelists, and I want to give them the space really to cover this subject where we're looking at where spirituality, art, religion, politics, secularism, values and morality kind of all meet and diverge and are in conflict with each other. So my four speakers are Agnieszka Kolek. So Agnieszka is, as I mentioned, co-curator of our series, Culture Tensions, but she's also a visual artist, curator, and co-founded the Passion for Freedom Festival, which took place in London for a few years. She holds an MA in Fine Art from the University of the Arts in London, and personally, she was brought up as a Catholic, and as a child, she suffered a serious illness, which made her realize how everything is impermanent and every moment is precious. Our second speaker will be the visual artist Byzantia Harlow. Byzantia graduated from the Royal College of Art in 2015. She's had solo exhibitions in London and participated in many group exhibitions, not only in the United Kingdom, but also in cities like Berlin and also in Portugal. Now, Byzantia's practice draws on faith, belief, ritual, replication, and gaps between experience and effect. Her installations ask the viewer to take a leap of faith through the door to possible enlightenment and potential disillusionment. Alongside her art practice, Byzantia also works as a psychic reader using a tarot deck that she created. She has a project on Soho Radio in London, which explores theoretical concerns in collaboration with invited guests. Our third speaker is Jan Tarnas, and Jan is an art historian, a literary critic, philosopher, and wears many hats. He's also a PhD student at the Faculty of Philosophy of the Catholic University of Lublin. His research fields includes art ontology, methodology and philosophy, art history and theory, literary theory. He's also the managing editor of A Big magazine, which, sorry if I did not pronounce that right, but A Big is the museum's literary and arts magazine, and he's been managing editor since January 2021. He's also writing a doctoral dissertation on the ontology of the work of art. And JJ Charlesworth, who's joining us via online, the great thanks that technology is working well. JJ sadly can't be with us. He had to call us at the last minute because he has COVID, which is well, we've all had it, and now it's JJ's turn to have it. So JJ, thank you for joining us online, even though you might not be fully healthy. But he's a writer and art critic. And since 2006, he has worked on the editorial staff of the London-based international art magazine, Art Review. He's one of the editors for that magazine. JJ studied fine art at Goldsmiths College in London in the mid-1990s, before turning his hand to criticism. He's written for many publications and online platforms. He writes frequently on the intersection of politics and art, particularly on the current culture wars debates, both in Europe and in America. He takes inspiration from the Marxist political tradition. JJ describes himself as a left libertarian. So JJ describes himself as a left libertarian and a humanist, opposing all forms of misanthropic, anti-human cultural tendencies, whether these come from the progressive left or the conservative right. So if I can get a quick round of applause for our speakers, and we'll get on with it. Thank you. So, Agnieszka, you're on.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that every one of us has got a microphone. I'm sorry. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us in person and online on Facebook with translation into Polish and on YouTube in original version in English. I hope you will share it with your friends so they can watch it later. I wanted to start with a few words saying that when I lived in Britain for the last 20 years, I could observe and experience the secularization of the society and how it manifests itself on different levels. And at the same time, I was observing the loss of free speech and free thinking space that could be like an open public space to discuss different things, different issues, but also different spheres of human experience when we are here on this earth. And a few years ago, I was at the event from Rebel Wisdom, which we have mentioned in our materials. And in that event, particular event, we had worked in small groups, and we were discussing things. What are we afraid to talk about in the public sphere, whether it will be workplace or between friends, or you go to a dinner party and you meet new people. And the two things that came up in the conversations, there was being afraid to talk about Islam and discussing the nature of the faith, whether positively or criticizing. And then the other subject was, in general, spirituality. And one of the guys that he talked about that, he said that he's afraid people will laugh at him if he talks about that sphere in his life. And that really struck me. And later on, in 2020, in January, I watched a conversation between one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom, David Fuller, with Lubomir Arsov. And that was a conversation about his animation called In the Shadow, the Modern Odyssey. And I was really moved by this animation and also by the conversation about it and how it seems there's not many artists that would like to enter this space and take that risk of exploring it within the artwork, and then together with the audience, with people that might not create. They come, whether they come to participate in the film screening or exhibition opening. And I found it really interesting, and I would like to share this animation with you, and I think for now that's enough for me. So, In the Shadow, A Modern Odyssey by Lubomir Arsov. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot in that animation to think about and lots of questions that is generating in my mind too. But we're going to move on because there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions after the presentations. So our next speaker is the artist Byzantia Harlow. So over to you, Byzantia.
Thanks. Am I on? I'm on. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming and everyone watching at home. Peter's going to bring me a clicker and I'll get started. Thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the terrible suffering right now in Ukraine. All those affected are within my prayers and all of ours, I'm sure. My work is not political, and other members of the panel may be better placed to analyze these world events within our discussion. But art does have an important social role, including during wartime, by giving name and form to incomprehensible events and promoting resolution and healing. We should consider how to support Ukrainian artists, particularly as there was a blossoming of the arts with independence. All artists need to consider the impact, and war merits the work and attention of artists to provide, document, testimony and comment, meaning and symbols that bridge the dichotomies it raises. One of the features of the war in Ukraine is incredulity, especially in Britain, maybe not so much here. Politicians and the public asking how this could happen in the Europe of today. But we did not have to use paranormal psychic process to have foreseen what was happening in Ukraine. Although several historical seers have predicted what in hindsight could resonate with present events, it was not just Nostradamus and Baba Wagner who foresaw this war. The internet, the digital crystal ball of collective intuition, refined by the algorithmic and meta-analytic search engines, was teeming with Vatic articles in the run-up to the invasion. However, there was a collective blindness, one which we must understand for the future. Putin himself, looking into his apathenic history and the future, declared himself as omniscient and godlike, as Janus presiding over the beginning and ending of conflict, and hence war and peace. He told the world of his plans in a trickster, two-faced manner, using diplomacy to lie about his true intentions and ambitions. As Zizek states in a recent essay, what will grow out of a pocket full of sunflower seeds? Our mistake was not to take Putin's threats literally enough. My view is that the situation was both predictable and yet subject to appeasing probability parallaxes that reduced risk where the majority thought it wouldn't happen or hoped it wouldn't happen. The same newspapers that predicted it would not occur now seem incredulous that they had given an inaccurate reading of the situation. The Soviet era was secular and rational on the surface and crushed religious and metaphysic thinking, sending ideas underground or into the unconscious. However, the state did investigate telepathy, telekinesis, foretelling of the future, psychic subterfuge, distal viewing, and interaction. This may explain the comeback of such things with a vengeance once Soviet oppression was seemingly loosened. This is a similar process in the secularization of Western culture. Spirituality never really went away, although it was largely mocked by intelligentsia. It is, in my opinion, part of our being and psyche. Our world is divided by differences in faith, reason, and causalities. Perhaps a new peaceful dialogue and tolerant coexistence between the spheres of faith and reason is needed in order to learn mutually and unify our dichotomies. The shadow of spirituality is secularism, and the shadow of secularism is spirituality. And what is needed is integration, not splitting and projection. One of my favorite quotes from Jung is, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." So I'm gonna see how the clicker works now. Yes. So to my artistic practice, it spans sculpture, installation, performance, and video. And I have a parallel paranormal career as a psychic, and both practices support each other. I explore ideas around faith, belief, and constructed experience, as well as the potential of art in facilitating a transitional space, shared encounter, and allowing personal and collective transformation. I feel that we have retained an inbuilt magical thinking with increasing secularism, and because of this, we feel a gap that was once filled by the spiritual or sublime. This gap can be filled by many things, including artworks. As humans, we need hope and faith, and we look for patterns to create meaning from the feared meaninglessness of the unknown or unintegratable. My spiritual beliefs are informed by my family history and personal experiences, including a near-death experience as a young child. On my father's side, I'm descended from an Italo-Byzantine family with a long-standing interest in the arcane. My father trained in Jungian analytical psychology and forensic psychiatry, and he researched post-traumatic distresses in soldiers and civilians, a consequence of activation of the shadow in a manner that was unintegratable to the psyche. On my mother's side, there's Bermudian and Cherokee heritage, and my Bermudian grandmother had a very deep interest in the paranormal, spiritualism, clairvoyance, and autosuggestion. And my mother's cousin has authored books on haunted houses. So it's really deep in the family. This is some documentation of a recent solo exhibition, Take What Resonates, and it was 2021. And the exhibition featured performance and sculpture and commented on the instinct to weave meaning into object and encounter, acknowledging the oscillation between faith and skepticism. The research incorporated a year of my observations from online psychics and reflected on my interpretation of the messages and meaning they offered. The work included a soundscape of recorded psychic predictions centering on those that came to pass or seemed accurate. So I was basically enacting the phenomenon of confirmational bias within that. The soundscape was very personal, but it was also very universal. So many people who came to see the show could walk in and they would get a message that resonated for them within the bit that they encountered. So I'm going to play a very short clip of that now.
Your offering is going to be very, very unique. It's going to be a combination of your art and your spiritual work. So it's one and the same thing, really. So you need to be out there. This is quite positive.
Self-employment suits your disposition and intentions. Working for yourself allows you to better follow your intuition and divine guidance. On the bottom, you've also got creative project as well.
And you've got to focus on your own creative projects.
To me, it feels like it's something that you completely forgot about. It's something that you're already supposed to have been doing or have out there. Like, to me, it kind of feels like a product. It feels like Oracle deck or something. I don't know what you do, but if you do something creative, they're kind of giving me an image of like a box that's dusty and it's half opened. What's the point of this sitting somewhere when it could be out there and gaining energy and being used?
So those were very accurate predictions. At the time of receiving the readings, I was actually creating my first tarot deck, which was alchemical, and I used a fake name during the time of getting the readings, so there was no way they could have known that. And eventually I let the accurate psychics know that I was doing a project, obviously, and my real identity. So my research also included watching literally thousands of YouTube tarot readings by online psychics. These are posted for unknown public audiences, but they purport to answer very personal questions like, how does he feel about me, and things like this. And they can be very sticky, sweet traps for the heartbroken who exchange one obsession for another within the giant crystal ball of the internet. The readings are very staged as well, and they can be quite damaging to view because there are obviously cognitive biases which open-ended statements can play into. And I did an art project relating to this genre called Lunar Water Tarot, where I constructed a series of very performative divinations on a YouTube channel that was based around different tarot cards using the deck I made, which we heard about earlier. And for example, I filmed The Hermit as a performance within a cave on the White Cliffs of Dover, and it was titled Still No Contact, Is It Over For Real? And it obliquely referenced the UK leaving the EU, so I was within this cave like lamenting and missing the EU, basically hoping it would contact me again. And it showed the constructed nature of the genre. I'm going to show just the very beginning of that clip now. it's meant to carry on playing, but never mind. Basically, people who knew my interest in constructed narratives still felt that these sort of readings resonated with them, although they're clearly highly staged, and you could see all my notes and the fact that someone was coming in and filming me. But even knowing they were performative, they could find messages within them that resonated. By the way, I was about to say, "Namaste, guys, welcome to my cave." And I was doing this whole bit of like going and foraging and, you know, sort of making fun of this idea of what a spiritual person may be doing, just meditating in this cave, but they have cell phone reception, you know, this kind of thing. But one of the most interesting aspects of this project was that other online tarot readers started incorporating the narrative devices that I used. Like, I started everyone using Scrabble tiles to get like letters and stuff, you know? So I did these sort of things, and then they would spread within these genuine divinations, and they would lift phrases from my videos. And this online world of fortune telling is really a huge kind of Ouroboros that eats its own tail, and in the end is the beginning. And it was very fascinating to see how quickly the videos I referenced started referencing me. I'm quite interested in that in my work. So hopefully, okay. I align to Swedish scientist turned psychic seer Swedenborg's take on spirituality as an active expression of love. I quote, "Heaven is not located on high, but where the good of love is, and this resides within a person. A life of kindness is the primary meaning of divine worship." Swedenborg saw the divine as present in all religions and highlighted that the inner and outer worlds were connected. He said, "Living an inner life and not an outer life at the same time is like living in a house that has no foundation, that gradually either settles or develops gaping cracks or totters until it collapses." In my early work, I looked at markets as secular spaces where people could come together and exchange both goods and spirit. I focused on verbal exchange in my project Spirit Line, where we have some documentation. This was produced in 2016 during a residency at the Luminary in St. Louis, for which I received Arts Council England funding. And I visited the Cahokia Mounds and met Native American artisans, reconnecting with my heritage. In St. Louis, spirituality was deeply juxtaposed with the commodification and appropriation of rituals. And one idea I tested within the project was that artworks could be a container for new ideas and rituals to which exposure produces a beneficial response in the participant, one which cannot be solely attributed to the project, but to the power which is bound into belief. Spirit line is a term in Native American weaving, the belief that a single thread allows the maker's spirit to a means of escape from the weaving, enabling them to create other works. The textile in this exhibition was a collaboration between myself and Michael Jenrich, who was a Franciscan monk who was taught by traditional native weavers. And the textile featured significant dream imagery recounted by members of the public to myself during my research. And the first person I spoke to recounted a dream of divine eyes, which was so powerful it compelled him to set up his not-for-profit bakery, which exclusively employed homeless people. His dream image is one of the images in the tapestry you can see of the eyes. And the tapestry was then printed on T-shirts and swapped with members of the community at a market in return for their participation in a ritual dream-telling session, which I later used as a soundscape for my radio series, The Silver Stream, on Soho Radio. And my projects usually have a moment where something breaks out of itself or there's a very interesting synchronicity. And this happened in this project. A homeless man collecting his T-shirt told me his dream of divine starry eyes, same dream as the guy who ran the bakery. And I introduced them, and then he was given a job there. And this is an example of how the kind of rituals took on their own life and had a positive effect on the community. And I do like to kind of revisit the community's years or keep in touch with people so I can see how relationships are going or how things have turned out. That's very important for me in my work. But I want to play one of these dream recordings now. Okay, tell me about your dream.
It's just going through the gates of heaven. I've been there. I've been there several times, over 10. I've seen Jesus. I've seen him live.
What did he look like?
Just like the pictures. He had stars in his eyes. And he told me he wanted me to get me off porno, hard drugs, and I've been clean over 20 years now.
Is that because you had the dream?
No, that was live. That was in Palm Springs, California, Chuckawalla Street, Indian Street.
Right.
The Indians were first. You know, it wasn't, what's his name? Christopher Columbus wasn't the first to discover America. The Indians were.
Yeah.
And then the Vikings. And then Christopher Columbus. They got that all wrong.
I like the way that he says he saw Jesus. No, that was live. I love that. He was great. Okay, so next slide. I think all art making is basically about constructing realities and building universes, and I really love the sensation of entering a complete world with the artist, an internal logic, mythology, and system of symbols. And for me, immersive installations through communal experience can really affect people universally. I explore notions of the chthonic in my work. So in solo exhibition Lunar Water, which we have documentation of now, I feigned sleep for 2 weeks within 10 tons of earth inside a gallery, and the earth was laced with fungal spores, and mushrooms began to grow during the exhibition. I shaped the earth to look like craters and had meteorite-style sculptures in reference to psychonaut philosopher Terence McKenna's theory of panspermia. The exhibition could have been experienced as one big hallucination, dream, or vision that played out for the audience as I lay sleeping in the earth. A video installation called When the Lion Roars explored apothenia using lunar landing conspiracy theories and urban myth, the dark side of the rainbow. I recreated this pairing, playing The Wizard of Oz with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon simultaneously. My secret to making them synchronize is held in the title. It does actually work, that urban myth. Okay. So humankind are connected through a collective unconscious, and this sculptural installation called Psilocybin, the Sediments of Sentiments, explored mushrooms as a metaphor for the layers of our reality. The structure we see growing above ground is really merely the fruit of a vast organism that spreads out through the subterranean layers. And I wanted a trippy, expansive feeling of taking magic mushrooms, the feeling of a surface alive and teeming with a sort of over-excess. I like to mix materials and create a sort of sensuality and ideas of changing forms from solid to liquid, from dry to wet. And the element of earth is obviously very important in my work, and I use a lot of ceramics for this reason, as well as actual earth. So I started a series of works around wells, beginning in 2017 in Lithuania while I was on a residence at Rupert. This research then took me to the Greek islands and led to conversations with a philosopher/monk at a monastery in Rhodes. I did several radio episodes in collaboration with Father Nilos. These works were about faith and questioning where we draw spiritual nourishment. The well as a metaphor for the internal world and our relationship to our inner source. This is an install shot of a video work titled The Worth of the Water When the Well is Dry, from a solo exhibition from the same source I have not taken. The video captured genuine interactions of ex-members of groups and healers alongside choreographed movements, and it was set to a composed score. I did research into various groups, including groups commonly referred to as cults. In my work, I create tensions between reality and fiction, using ideas of unreliable narrators, group illusions, delusions, and drinking the Kool-Aid in order to find enlightenment. And I aim to take the viewer on a journey between imagined effect and debunked dream, between showmanship and shamanship. And I actually think it's possible to find genuine meaning within constructed experience, and I like to offer people a setting in which to do this. I think conspiracy groups and cults make use of the sense of separation that people experience by giving them a semblance of acceptance and locus of control in their fear of a meaningless, random world. And instead, I would advise people to look inwards and develop their own intuition and personally meaningful relationship with the universe. This is the final slide. I have had COVID recently, so It's getting hard to talk as well. So obviously spirituality has had a huge resurgence as it offers an alternative to culturally normative systems that no longer seem to be working, especially for those who feel marginalized or betrayed by convention. It offers a container to question the arranged order and break out of predefined social norms. Through time, art has had a similarly important role in making sense or narrative of difficult events. In this respect, I think of Susie Gablick's book, The Reenchantment of Art, and I quote, "Reenchantment refers to the change in the general social mood towards a new pragmatic idealism and more integrated value system that brings head and heart together in an ethic of care as part of a healing for the world." In summary, artworks can function as mirrors to society. Reflecting back society, they can be dark and yet illuminate darkness that needs to be seen. The mirrored reflection can be protective, reflecting what would be petrifying and rendering it safe for view. Like Perseus's mirror, which allowed him to slay Medusa, artworks can turn society's psychological dirt into something that can be enlightening and healing, like broken bones that knit together stronger, or an irritating grain of dirt accruing healing nacre and forming a pearl within an oyster. I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Byzantia. We're going to move on very quickly to Jan Tarnas.
Thank you very much. Is it working? All right. Thank you very much, Agnieszka and Manick, for inviting me to this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or even good evening. At the outset, I must admit that despite the breadth of my research areas, I have not been a practitioner but a theoretician for years. So let me take on a journey through the world of ideas. And I promise I will keep my speech short, so bear with me. For just as Aristotle noticed that there is nothing in the myths that would not have been in this sense before, there is nothing in art that would not have appeared before in the thought. And please forgive me for using the text before the discussion, but in such a short space-time, it will be a significant help in conveying my line of reasoning, which loves to get in digressions. So to begin with, anyone who thinks that the division between the sacred and the profane corresponds to the division of real space into the area of religious rituals and the entire sphere of life beyond them is wrong. This tension between the sacred and the profane, well captured in the subject of these debates, indicates a much more interesting and deeper context of problems, in which the question so important for our culture environment resounds. What is art? And what is its function in shaping the civilization? Regardless of whether we realize that the sacred is unshakable absolute, and the profane is the word of the value of matter, which is a response to our whims of everyday life, we must notice that by postulating the existence of both of them, we assume the existence of a word of values, which firstly distinguish the sacred from the profane, and secondly, more importantly, it creates a hierarchy of values. And without that hierarchy, we are unable to take any action in the name of good. Because without the absolute sacred at the top of this hierarchy, something like good cannot even exist. And before I turn to the conclusions directly related to art, allow me to digress a bit about the current situation and this heroic struggle that we observe in the Ukraine. In times of peace, it is easy for us to live in a profane sphere, which in its essence is an unsatisfied comfort in life, because we always want more and better. But when war comes, we observe people who do not run away with jewelry, but with a cut in a career. Because only such situations verify the claim that, in fact, we care about intangible things such as life and freedom. Freedom understood as the right to decide about ourselves. There is no doubt that the sacred disclassifies the profane. But interesting fact is that the sacred is multi-dimensional. In a decade when human life is despised, it is easy to argue that human life is the highest possible value in the world. But looking at the realities of war happening in our neighborhood, it is impossible not to notice that freedom is a value of greater value in life. It is impossible to function in purely rational terms in the world, which is clearly demonstrated by the situation in Ukraine. How else to explain the readiness to defend the homeland, the awareness of taking actions threatened with death to hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both professional and above all volunteers, if we do not refer to pride, honor, love, or sense of freedom? The gradation of sacred over life, these are really intriguing dilemmas because they rise above the value of life. As Exupery said, human life is the highest value, but sometimes we act as if there was something more important. But what? And the war in Russia. Do you know what Putin is not a problem nowadays? The individual in power makes no difference at all, be it Peter the Great, Stalin, or Putin. The problem is pseudo-civilization in which the so-called good does not come to absolute. If the hierarchy of what we call good is not justified by the absolute good, the sacred good, then it is not good at all, but a synonymous for the statement, I do what I want to do, because I consider it useful for myself at the moment. This is what I want to do, let my will be done to me. And this is the case of Russia, the aim of which is a sense of domination. And from that perspective, Russia is an extremely racist country. Because on what basis do they claim that they should rule over nations? Violating one of the most fundamental and sacred rights of humanity, the right to equality. Without value, art is only a journalism focusing in its lens a description of current events, without asking about their meanings, or a tool in the hand of social engineering. The problem is that art that serves the short-term purpose without an important message is not worth more than a cookbook. That is why we constantly return to Greek tragedies, because unchaining imponderabilia constantly concern us and move us. Sacrum is the doctrine of objective values, the belief that some responses are really right and others are really wrong, with what the universe is and what we are. Recognition of the sacred imposes a certain consequence, according to which our judgment about reality determines not only to our emotional relationship to what is the subject of our review, but the question about our rational order in relation to this reality, about how to behave towards it, as well as about to judge whether our emotions' responses are right. And this was what art served for decades. It had a paranetic function that dealt with one upbringing of humanity. This is what distinguishes education, understood as a propagation of humanity, between one generation and another, and propaganda, consisting of conditioning of a new generation in a way towards a goal that is not, that society and generation does not understand at all. And C.S. Lewis once said, "The head rules the lower abdomen through the torso or the chest, the seat of generosity, the seat of the emotions from which the instilled habit shapes the constant feelings. chest, generosity, affection. These are the indispensable liaisons officers between the man of intellect and the man of instinct. It can even be said that it is thanks to this middle element that the man is precisely man, because the intellect itself makes him only a spirit, and the desires themselves makes him an ordinary animal. The end of quotation. By giving up the sphere of sacred, we limit ourselves to the reality in which the main slogan is development in the name of progress, in the name of increasing man's power over nature. The problem is that there is no real increase of freedom of people in general. Progress increases the power of individuals over other individuals, and consequently leads to a restriction of their freedom. An example of such development is an advancement of technology and its impact on disinformation. Let us note that, which the sacred understood in this way, we are talking to a large extent about culture in a philosophical sense, about what opposes our humanity to nature. If we start to fight culture, fight with what develops our humanity, then we set culture against nature, which, despite the panic of activists fighting for the good of the planet, will win anyway. The crucial question is, will man survive? Either we are rational spiritual beings, forever guilty of obedience to absolute values, or we are only a product of nature, freely kneaded and squared according to the will of the rulers, who by definition cannot have motives over their natural reflexes. Apart from the reality of the sacred, there is no common human law of conduct that would apply to both the rulers and the ruled. Faith in objective values is essential for a notion of power that is not tyranny, and obedient that it is not slavery to any reason death. We used to believe that this is what Western civilization is all about. The greatest works of art were created in the name of this belief. The question is, do we still want to believe it? Otherwise, we become prisoners of the profane, the world of material values, and we must come to terms with the bitter truth that Hemingway emphatically expressed when he said, "Madame, all stories, if continued far enough, end in death." And he is no true storyteller who would keep that from you. And to end my short speech, I would like to quote a great Polish poet of the Romantic period, Cyprian Kamil Norwid, who once wrote a poem in which he said, "Poetry without gold is poor, but gold without it. I tell you, verily it is misery. It will disappear and the variety will crawl over. Treasures and strength will shake, all will tremble. Only two of the things of this world will remain. Only two. Poetry and goodness, and nothing more. Even without two of them, a skill becomes less of a paper. These two sisters are so different." Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. We're going to move on to JJ in Folkestone.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Fantastic. I've got a bit of an echo on my headphones, so if your sound guys can just turn down the channel a bit, maybe I'll do that. That's better. Wave if you can hear me now, because I can't hear you. Great. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to be with you. I hope my voice holds up. If I'm a bit croaky, I apologize. but thank you for tolerating this digital connection to your discussion. This is a fascinating discussion because it's already clear that there are quite a number of very different takes in and out of the issue of the sacred. And for me, the sacred and the profane have been, for a very long time actually, have been aspects of artistic culture during the period of modernity. Profanity, to start with, was an attack on orthodoxy. So if you think about Europe of the late European culture in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it was often a response to the power of the Catholic Church. If you think of the symbolists all the way through the Dadaists and the Surrealists, mocking and attacking the established church was a rejection of the moral authority of organized religion and often its complicity with state power. So there's always been, for example, in terms of 20th modern art from the 19th century onwards, certainly a kind of provocative and rebellious aspect to profanity, which is an attack on the authority of Orthodox religion. So one level, I think, artists tend to flirt with the profane as a posture of defiance to the restrictive moral norms of their society at a given time. But it's also true that they do genuinely invest themselves in the mystical and the sacred. I think this is important. It's not just a form of provocation or rebellion, even though there are many artists who have profaned against authority through their art, and often have been accused of profanity, even though the way they engaged through their art was actually a form of their own form of the sacred, their own expression of the sacred. I think this is particularly the case as artists become increasingly disenchanted with modernity and the modern world. I think it's important that the mystical and the sacred are understood as in relationship to the way in which the modern world sees itself. So I want to focus my comments on this question of the trouble with modernity, what I would call the disenchantment with the modern world, and the loss of confidence in the intellectual and social values which have defined modernity. During the 20th century, we can see how this disenchantment grew at the edges of Western culture at first, through the adoption of invented as well as rediscovered occultism, as well as the borrowing of non-Western spiritualism of all kinds. I mean, if you think about the early art history of avant-garde modernism, you can think of, and also the culture associated around it. Think of the neo-paganist Aleister Crowley, who is an important figure in relationship to how counterculture and avant-garde culture dealt with the idea of the magical and the occult, and also the spiritual. Think about the adoption by the Bauhaus teacher Johannes Itten, who took up Zoroastrianism, or the influence of Zen Buddhism on John Cage, or how Allen Ginsberg, for example, the figurehead of the Beat generation, turned to Hare Krishna, or how the Beatles got into the unorthodox Hindu sect of the Maharishi and transcendental meditations, and so on and so on. Joseph Beuys takes on the symbolic mantle of the shaman in his work. Vienna actionist Hermann Nitsch creates his Orgies Mysteries Theatre, if people were familiar with that period in West European avant-gardism. Performances and rituals which are full of purgative ritual and blood sacrifice. I mean, really quite extreme events which are often censored or curtailed by the authorities. And even conceptualist artists have a relationship to the idea of the mystical. So Sol LeWitt, in his Sentences on Conceptual Art, which is a famous conceptualist text from 1969, he begins those by saying that conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. So I guess what I'd like to point out is that for me, the counterculture, as it is, the counterculture of the 1960s, sent out all these very heterodox seeds of spiritual and quasi-spiritual alternatives to the modern Western outlook. And in the last 50 years, we've seen all of these make their way into everyday culture. So if, like me, you grew up in a small provincial town in England during the 1980s, it was quite boring. But what was interesting is that you found that your friends were suddenly into New Age. They were into crystals and dream catchers and psychedelic drugs and cannabis and vegetarianism and yoga, right? And of course, everyone does yoga now. And even rock singer Nick Cave does transcendental meditation. And if you try Googling meditation for Ukraine, this is kind of picking up on some of the comments that Byzantia made, you'll find many groups organizing group meditation to bring peace and healing in a war zone. Now, this is partly, I think, how popular culture and mass culture, like non-official culture, has assimilated a lot of the kind of influences of the counterculture over several decades. Contemporary art hasn't, I would say, had such a keen interest in the mystical and the sacred up until recently. Certainly during the more deconstructive and skeptical postmodernism of the 1980s and the 1990s, spiritualism and religion and occultism, all the baggage of the hippie era, tended to be seen as naive expressions of Western desire for an unattainable, authentic existence. I mean, in some sense, those early postmodernists had some critical engagement with the desire for authentic, originally human, and pre-lapsarian Eden of humanity before modernity. So you notice that a lot of postmodern art of the 1980s and 90s didn't have very much interest in these ideas because they themselves were associated with the culture of the previous generation. But in the popular culture, at the same time, I think these countercultural legacies continue to thrive as people have turned increasingly to alternative ways of living and being when they are faced with the sad and dismal reality of capitalism, for which there seem to be no alternatives. But I guess in recent years, what's been interesting to notice is that how the figures of the shaman and the witch and of occult practices and magic have found their way into contemporary artistic practice again. An artist I encountered early in the 2000s, quite, very long time ago now, an English artist called Marcus Coates, deliberately trained himself as in shamanic ritual. He was training himself to be a shaman as part of his own holistic, very ecological worldview. I was never sure whether Marcus really believed what he was doing. He certainly was very serious about it. And it seemed at the time incredible that an artist who had come from the secular atheistic world of art be so unambiguous in his commitment to what I thought was a form of magical superstition. And certainly in the critical and very materialistic art world of the early 2000s, there was actually very little room for such work. But I would have to say that over the last decade or so, such occult figures have become more credible and popular within the institution of art schools and art students and artists, and also in art theory. And I think this is because they relate to a number of important trends that have emerged intellectually over the last decade or so. And it's represented in academic theory, but it's also more broadly available in intellectual culture. So, for example, I think if you take the figure of the witch, and I don't want to go too much into these, just quickly sketch these out, but the figure of the witch has been revived partly by contemporary fourth wave feminism as a sort of critical rejection of patriarchal and heterosexual culture, as well as actually offering an authentic form of empowerment. Right? So it's both critical and invested. And from a completely different angle, and this relates to the figure of the shaman in a certain sense, the politics of indigeneity and the knowledge of indigenous people has become an increasingly important aspect of post-colonial discourse. So there is and in as much as indigenous theory or theory of indigeneity has become an important academic discourse in the West, it's noticeable how the idea of Western and non-Western knowledge has become the way in which we understand the difference between modernity and indigeneity. Now, I would say that these are part of what I would call the latest phase in the disenchantment of Western culture that has been going on in earnest since the end of the 1960s. I think this disenchantment is both political and cultural. I say political because I think that today we've largely given up on a politics of collective action that was about reshaping society for our own interests. Of course, political activists today still talk of change or making change, but in many ways, I think this is about changing us more than it is about changing society. Now, what I mean by that is that when we say changing us, it's about changing the Western-created, rationalist, materialist, acquisitive, colonizing modern subject. So, of course, when we think of the narrative that dominates our visions of the future, when we think about the old visions of political change that motivated, both the left and right during the 20th century, when we think about the narratives that dominate our visions of the future today, they're mostly of catastrophe, and it's usually ecological. But what's hidden inside, or what's embedded or embodied in these visions of catastrophe, is our acceptance as a culture that it is us, our industrial, materialist, consumerist, capitalist society, that is itself the problem. Now, I think inside that criticism of modern industrial life is a suspicion that our way of being, our form of subjectivity, is itself the product of the supposedly destructive social form. When you think about the beatniks and the hippies of the counterculture, they once saw in the Eastern spiritual traditions a way to get out of your head, which is to say, to find a different form of consciousness, or even a transcendence from consciousness, that did not rely on technology and industry and the materialism of the modern West. And in a similar way, neo-pagans in the West sought out the cultural traditions that predate the modern age, seeing human life as intertwined with nature and the natural order in a way which is completely antithetical to the modern industrial era. But in the wake of the counterculture has come what I think is a period of growing intellectual attack on some of the foundational concepts on which the culture of the Enlightenment and modern society has been based. If you think about it, ideas about humans as rational, active beings, or of scientific knowledge and of speculative reason, the idea of progress in human history, which might be defined by human society's capacity to determine its own social organization and its own destiny. In recent years, many of these very established traditions of thought on which I would argue modern society is largely based have come under attack. The idea that society can be governed and determined by free-willing subjects has been dismissed as a fantasy. And while the belief that there should be only one truth, or that there is a possible single truth, or that we can say for sure what constitutes social progress, have all been dismissed as Eurocentric fantasies of domination. I think what's an interesting example, just a quick example of how far this idea of skepticism about the foundations of a modern outlook have become, and how far they've advanced in the academy. If people think back to last year, in the middle of last year, a group of academics at the University of Auckland in New Zealand published an open letter to oppose the idea that Maori knowledge should be taught as part of the orthodox science curriculum. Those academics were disputing the idea that indigenous knowledge should be set on an equal level as empirical scientific knowledge, that's to say science in the Western or modern sense. But rather than being supported by their fellow academics, they were denounced and shouted down by their peers, with one of the most common criticisms being that the so-called Western science was inherently colonizing. Now, I guess what I want to suggest is that in the last 20 or 30 years, the idea that underpin modern society, both in philosophical and political terms, have almost completely disintegrated. And this has allowed other ideas, which once existed in the margins, to move to the center. By modern societies, I don't just mean Western societies, of course, but the societies that have emerged out of that long period of modernity that started in the West, which is industrial and productive and technologically sophisticated, societies that have flourished all around the world and which have raised people out of the most brutal poverty and have extended life and health and indeed liberty. But that model of the modern society is now experiencing a sort of a profound loss of faith in itself, a kind of moral exhaustion in which it sees itself as the problem. And instead, our societies tend to see themselves as destructive and unsustainable. No contemporary society I can see anywhere around the world at the moment seems particularly happy with itself. Of course, it's also to be noted that one of the products of this malaise is a turn to esoteric forms of knowledge everywhere, not just to do with certain progressive approaches to spiritualism or occult beliefs. But you can actually notice this in all kinds of places. They're not, of course, forms of knowledge, but they're actually forms of superstition. That's why we see the turn to esotericism in the rise of conspiracy culture and paranoid thinking, for example, in QAnon and elsewhere, often marked by the desire to return to more authentic modes of being and perception. It's quite a messed up and contradictory cultural situation that we have at the moment. But it's not surprising, for example, that the most famous image of the Capitol Hill riots was, of course, of the QAnon shaman. People remember that image of the guy dressed up in a kind of bizarre kind of concoction of different symbols with his furry horned hat on and his spear and so on. Of course, the QAnon shaman caused anger amongst those in the neo-pagan community who saw this as a travesty of their identity. But it's also why many commentators have been unable to grasp why progressive alternative cultures, such as the wellness movement, have apparently become drawn into the supposedly right-wing world of anti-vaxxers and anti-lockdown protesters. It's not the case that, I mean, what I think is important to notice is that a kind of view of the world which sees things in terms of symbols and patterns and mythological forms is also partly involved in some of these more regressive paranoid cultural forms and expressions. I think that, however, that the cultural outcome of this is that if ideas of reason and rational action, science and progress are finished, and if we agree then that the human culture and the consciousness formed by those ideas is dangerous and destructive, then of course the only alternative can be a return to the pre-modern, right? This is, for me, the cultural driver for the current revival of the sacred, the mystical in art. The ideas of the counterculture, which lived at the edge of mainstream Western cultures for decades, has finally taken over. Magic replaces science, belief replaces knowledge, ritual replaces rational action. And at the same time, the idea of the distinctly human subject, a being which is qualitatively different in its capacity and potential from the rest of nature, is dismissed as a hubristic, arrogant figure. The current fashion in a lot of art, in fact, in a lot of artistic practice, is to talk about how we are intertwined with non-human entities who have as much agency as we humans do, and who have their own forms of knowledge, their own forms of consciousness, and so on. We are not, in this sense, human subjects anymore, but rather objects, much like any other, the product of networks and forces of nature which we have little capacity to influence. We can see, of course, how the critique of anthropocentrism of recent years is really a critique of a human subject and a society that puts itself above nature, which seeks to shape and modify nature for its own ends. Those forms of consciousness, by contrast, which seek to be at one with the natural order, are now more culturally acceptable than this anthropocentric view of human beings. I mean, if you think of the kind of Hollywood mysticism which is found in James Cameron's movie Avatar from 2009, in that there is the colonizing, technologically driven, acquisitive, warlike human race, which is faced with an indigenous alien culture, which is psychically connected to the planet it inhabits. You can see how that vision was already acceptable in 2009, and now I think it's almost become a kind of cultural orthodoxy, ironically within the society that it criticizes. And so in conclusion, I think we can see that this view of a dominating and expansive society is one which is, however, it has become exhausted of any meaning. Why do we continue like this is really the issue. Our contemporary moment seems to have no answer to this. It has run out of a sense of its own purpose. It has run out of any energy. So to conclude, I think it's important to realize that in this moment, artists, just like the rest of us, are starting to turn to forms of enchantment to put meaning back into what might be the terminus of our own modernity. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, JJ. That's, I'm glad we had you last, actually, because I think there's trying to weave the threads and the themes that are coming up. Just my kind of reflections that the animation certainly kind of portrays, as JJ kind of implies, the profane as this kind of mundanity of everyday life. You know, we go to work, we feed our kids, we play on social media, we are obsessed with a material, consumerist world, in a sense, you know, brainwashed, and the images of science and pills and medicine, you know, being as much of a sense of medical or social control over us. So, you know, it kind of connects a bit with what JJ was talking about. And Byzantia, you know, I think there's an interesting territory, because you know, you don't buy into the whole thing of the psychic and the mystical. You are also a bit of a skeptic on some of that, and particularly around religious cults or, I suppose, other forms. But your thoughts of the internet as the kind of the broad church, the kind of crystal ball of knowledge and communication is an interesting metaphor. Agnieszka, it's really interesting to see why you chose this film. It'd be quite good to hear more about what your thoughts are on that choice. And it's had 5 million views on YouTube, so it's obviously a very popular animation. And Jan, you know, I think your kind of take on values and moral values and that kind of loss, you know, within our everyday world, in a profane world, and you quote C.S. Lewis, you know, who is a wonderful writer, but also a Christian and very a writer of the faith. There's a sort of disillusionment between secularism which JJ highlighted, but also organized religion, and particularly Western Christianity. Obviously, we're seeing the rise of faith in Islam, and also growths of other kind of strands of Christianity, particularly in non-European countries. So, you know, it's not as if religion is dead or in the decline, but it feels so strongly so within most of Europe. Perhaps Poland and Lithuania are exceptions in that sense, because among young people, religion is still very strong. But it'd be interesting to see what the audience thinks of that. So, Agnieszka, why did you choose this film?
I think I was fascinated by the resonance with the global online community. As you said, it's more than 5 million views, and it's growing every day, a few thousand. And I think it's a bit like, it acts a bit like a mirror to all of us, because we can see a reflection of ourselves. It doesn't have to be necessarily the full picture, but it's just how lost we became in the smart technology, thinking that this is progress. You just pull the plug and that's it. We are naked. And also our projection of whether it would be through the technology, projecting our fantasies, or whether through searching through psychedelics, where we try to get to the higher self. And it's not that it's not possible, but this is a shortcut, and quite often it's a dead-end street. And that we don't want to go back to the source, to go back to that actually this is all within us, but we just have to unveil it. And I think that's what really was mainly bothering me with this animation. And then the fact that what I love about it is that it's not this kind of nihilistic, self-flagellating approach that we see so much in the Western world, Western Europe and United States and so on, where all sins and all thoughts are ours and there is no redemption, and that's it. Maybe we should just commit a group suicide here and now and just make it easier for everyone. Actually, it sees that, no, you have it within you, you just have to unveil it. How? That's obviously a question for the whole panel, and maybe for the whole life of each one of us individually. So this is one of the main drives for me to share this animation. Yeah, I think I finished at that.
What about your thoughts, Byzantia, on what's generally been?
On which bit of what?
Anything
on
that you
the
want,
QAnon stuff?
Yes, I think the QAnon
really
stuff is
enjoyed
interesting.
JJ's bit. I actually watched with great interest, because with my project where I was getting all these psychic readings done, so just to explain, I used to be a tarot reader like 18 years ago, but I hadn't done it for years. And then in this project where I was getting readings done for myself, they were all saying, oh, you should be doing readings, you're psychic, you'll make loads of money. Because I was following their advice, I started doing it online, and now I'm one of the best psychics online, you know. And they were right. And then I was doing all this research on YouTube with these tarot readings, which are fascinating because they're just completely bizarre and they're quite dangerous. But all of the tarot readers started getting into QAnon, and I was watching this, and I did a talk with a tarot reader who was one of the only other ones who wasn't getting into QAnon, and we were talking about how bonkers it was on her YouTube channel. But I could understand, because I have done a lot of research into cults, and it is this thing of, you know, JJ was talking about it in a different way to me, but it's this idea of the shadow of the things that we repress, or this idea of feeling that there's something missing and trying to find it, and then someone gives you a solution and says, well, you don't need to find it because I'm it, so, you know, follow me. But also QAnon was using language that was very specifically linked to certain spiritual things, and so that's why it kind of sucked people in. It was very like strategically done to use that language. So I could understand how it was happening, but I was also like, you guys, like, what are you doing? This is bizarre. And so there would be these tarot readings where they would show how constructed the genre was, because they would say, this is not a real tarot reading, I'm going to use these cards to illustrate a story, which is what they were doing in all of them. And then they would start doing conspiracy theories with their cards and like telling, you know, QAnon narratives with their tarot cards. It was just absolutely fascinating to watch. And I knew something was going to happen, like what happened. But I watched it with great fascination. So I enjoyed that part of, JJ's talk. It was interesting. But yeah, I guess we're all looking for this thing, and I believe what you believe, that we need to find it within ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Jan, it seems like I know that you're not a great fan of contemporary art or modern art. I think from our informal conversations you mentioned that. So you talked about the dichotomies of these false dichotomies of the sacred and the profane, but you also, I think, hint at something which perhaps might be more tied to the Christian faith, about moral values, and where are these values in the sense of within art and within spiritualism and also within politics. I mean, could you elaborate a bit more about your thoughts on that, particularly around perhaps what seems to be the decline of secularism, and perhaps what we need to kind of redeem within more kind of traditional faiths or thoughts or philosophies?
Great question. I have absolutely no idea. I'll try to answer in some sort, in some way. Of course, I'm a Catholic, and that's the main definition of my way of thinking, although I believe it's not a case of Catholicism or a religion at all. I think it's more a case of a philosophy you practice in your life, the way of thinking. And I believe the sacred and profane issue is currently very important because of the culture wars we are currently in. We used to work on the culture wars issue and problems regarding culture wars and art world a year ago, and we published a whole issue about that in the Zamek magazine in the January 2021. If some of you would like to find it and read it, you can find it in the internet on the Zamek magazine website. But at the bottom, after all the work was done and all the articles and columns and essays were written, we found out that the main problem of the culture war is the fact that we are entering the age of the end of reason, so to say. And there's a great quotation from not so good TV series when one of the characters says that welcome to the age of the death of reason. There's no right or wrong not anymore. There's only being in and then being out. And I believe that the culture wars and the whole concept between, just organizing societies, not nations, but societies, one against each other, can happen because we are resigning the consideration of a sacred and profane intention. And I believe we don't need a religion at all to define why the sacred is important to our lives. We can, of course, implicate Catholicism and the eternal and absolute values, objective values to life, and that's very simple. We can do the same with Islam to some consent. We can do that with Taoism, we can do that with Confucianism and some sort of ancient religions. But I believe what's common to all of them, what C.S. Lewis thought is common to all of those religious or spiritual movements, is the concept that there are values that are objective and they implicate the reasoning in life and as well the reasoning in art. Because if we deny the existence of sacred, we deny the existence of something, so to say, good and something, so to say, bad, we cannot determine whether our actions or our practice or our way of thinking is good or it is bad. Therefore, we cannot determine what art is and what purpose does it serve. And it's not only a matter of art world or the societies, but we live in the post-pandemic world. I truly hope so, that we are done with this whole pandemic confusion in the world. But the pandemic period proved that the globalization is a way shot. And the way to deal with pandemic was a deal of the national countries and the way that nation came out with the ways of dealing with pandemic, not societies, but nations. And culture is one of the important areas that creates nations, alongside with language, history, religion, and common ground, so to say. But through culture, without values in culture, we deconstruct the concept of nations. Therefore, we deconstruct the concept of civilization. Therefore, we have the culture wars currently in the world. And the concept of reorganizing religions, reorganizing orthodox way of thinking, reorganizing the philosophy, modern philosophy. JJ talked a little bit of the postmodern reality, and I heard recently that we are not living in a postmodern world anymore. We are living in a re-modern world, because postmodern way of thinking used to say that we have to push forward no matter what. And the only rule to postmodernists was not to take a step backwards to the place when we had a good life, when the circumstances were good, and everything was fine. And the remodern word, as I heard about it, is the concept that we are pushed even further, but we are losing contact with our roots. And we lost our attachment to reasoning. And that, I believe, is another problem of the profane and sacred issue. It's not only an artistic word, not only a cultural issue, but the bottom line that we find in this tension between sacred and profane, even if we skip the whole religious concept, is the idea that we are losing some sort of reasoning in our actions and reasoning in creating art. And if we lose reasoning in art, the question is what art is. Is it only a craftsmanship? Because, you know, making painting, making sculptures, acting in a theater, in a circus, being a musician on a stage, it does not imply that you are an artist, and it does not imply that you are making an art. And I believe that living in a Western society, living in a Western culture, we believe that art is about something cognitive that made an implication to our humanity. And if we skip that whole religious concept, either we are Orthodox, Catholic, Christian, Islamic, whatever, but if we deny that we are not reasoning if something is good, something is better, and something is the absolute good, we deny the whole concept of need of existence of art, as well as the need of existence of humanity itself. So the culture is losing, the nature is winning, and the man is lost.
Okay, that's, yeah, very complex, and that I'm going to process all the kind of stuff. But what I'm going to do, I think it really doesn't, we need to open it out to the audience. We've talked amongst ourselves, there's lots of food for thought, but it'd be great to hear your questions from you, and if you have got a statement or thought reflection, if you can keep that concise, but preferably questions to the panel.
If anyone needs a microphone, I can do a run. Anyone wants to ask a question? I can bring the microphone. Oh, yes. It's nice to see you again. Thank you for coming.
Okay, so firstly, I want to say that I'm really happy to be here. And secondly, returning to my question, so before the 20th century, for the most part, the norms and the morals of the society were dictated by the religion, by church, and people were not allowed to question them. So the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought was impossible. Now the science is the new king or the new queen, and most of the people have turned from the religion to the science. But we also should not forget that the scientists, especially in the union with the establishment, can also be biased, and it is, well, in general, it is also like prohibited to question the science today. So what the science tells you, you should do exactly that. And if we imagine the society where the freedom of speech is the norm, what kind of like the worldview, the religious one or the rational one with the science would suit this society better?
That's a great question. So this, I suppose, scientism and what is seen as progress, and there's a greater questioning of that. Who would like to respond to that thought? Would you like to say something, JJ?
Yeah, thank you. It is a good question. I think, sorry, just 1 second. I mean, I think that what's important about that question is the relationship between beliefs and faiths and social norms, and more broadly, the idea of community, right? So I think what's really important at the moment is that we are, I think, in a culture where we don't have very strong ideas about what values we should share as a society or as a culture. So when we talk about the culture wars at the moment, what we see is people shouting at each other about the fact that they have a better idea than the other person about what is the best way to live, right? The culture wars are actually a very kind of extreme form, I think, of a lack of certainty about how we should share social and cultural and moral values, I guess, as a society. So I think that's quite an important point, because in reality, Orthodox religion in the old days, in the past, tended to impose social order through orthodoxy, and we've moved away from that completely. So I think what's different now is, though, that we have all kinds of values produced by all kinds of different ways for people to live by. But it's very difficult for people as a society to find shared beliefs or shared values or shared perspectives that will help them live alongside each other. I think that's a really critical thing at the moment. I think it's partly it's important to think of this idea of the loss of faith. Jan is talking about C.S. Lewis, and it's a long period in Christian faith in Britain, for example, intellectuals who were either Catholics or Anglicans, but Christians, but went through quite a serious period of dissolution with the idea of tradition and the idea of Christian faith as a founding element in cultural, in social tradition and the culture of a society. And I think we have not actually been able to restore any of that, right? I think it's important to recognize also in this video that we've been watching that there is a degree of paranoia that we all share now about contemporary culture, which makes us feel very disconnected from each other. So if you're watching that video, there are two elements that come out for me. One is that it's actually a conspiracy video, right? So actually the world is run by shadowy people, right? This is the classic sort of trope of the world which is run by people we cannot see and do not know. And on the other hand, the way to resolve this is the kind of cosmic reconnection with the natural order. And I think what these things are suggesting to us is that we have a real problem with how to develop social values that we share, right? So either society is run by people who don't have our interests at heart and who are hidden, or we have to reach to a kind of utopian idea of cosmic togetherness, right? I mean, neither of them are true. And also, I think that they are opposites. They complement each other. But in the middle, the problem is for us as societies, as modern societies, how we develop a new set of social values and how we develop a kind of discussion that tries to establish what we share and what we aspire to as a society. Because I think if we don't get that, then we are in a situation where we look forward to a kind of culture of fear and crisis, and yet we also then find ourselves in a situation where we distrust each other and find ourselves in conflict with each other in a way which doesn't allow us to develop a more sustained social discussion what we should try to share as a society. I think that those two things are interrelated. Where are you, Manick?
So, here I am. Agnieszka, you wanted to make a few short comments.
Yes, a few things came to my mind. It's that it seems we are at the time of the chaos where certain things we kind of think they completely dissolved, but they still resonate and they have a meaning. While then with scientism and this belief in science, like it's going to save us and it only will be progress, all of a sudden we also see that's not working, but still we don't have an answer. So it's a bit of this time where, as it's dissolving, at the same time something else needs to emerge, but it's not clear yet what and how. So this is one thing. Then I think that links in with the internet, and where before it was much easier to spout certain messaging and make sure everyone gets it and follows it. Now, that doesn't work anymore as well, but at the same time, it brings this danger of just manipulating small groups of people against others, because it seems like it's also chaotic space on the internet where it's easy to do that. So this came to my mind. And then also, I found it very interesting, how do you bring the cohesion within that, within these small groups at that time of dissolved center or kind of linear thinking and linear way of disseminating the information. So that was just vibrating for me, listening to the question and then to the answer. So I don't know if any of you has got any comments on that.
To make a contribution to your question about science, I would like to say something, maybe not an answer, but to postulate a question. Because you asked about science, and there is something very similar between science and ethics that few people do understand nowadays. Science is not about creating a vision of our world. It's about discovering how the world exists and how the world works. And same with values. I do believe personally that we cannot create any sort of values that push us towards good, that push us towards reasoning, how to get better personally, how to evolve our humanity, and how to act in the name of good. I cannot think as a philosopher of a single value that we created as a humankind ever that pursued us to look for good and to act in the name of good. And there's the difference between ethical values and the social values. How do we organize a society, and how do we live in a good way, personally and as a society? And there is something common nowadays between science and ethics, because we used to think that science is unshakable. Despite the humanities, that's why we created the name the humanities and laughed for ages about the humanities, that all the professors at academia of humanities cannot say anything important about the word, because every single one of them was thinking about what's good for human being and the man. And the science was unshakable. And we used to believe whatever science discovered, it was a sacred truth about the reality of the word. And that doctrine has ended. We live in a world when biology defined clearly there are two chromosomes, XX and XY. Two sexes, two genders, that's it. And what society said, not recently, but few decades ago, no. And what proof do we have scientific? None. And that's one example, and that's a very risky example, and I'm quite aware of it. But that's the way the world is thinking right now. We are trying to define the science because we're trying to define the truth. And same with values, same with sacred, and same with profane. And it's not really a matter of what sort of religious concept you have in yourself, or what scientific profession do you pursue in your life, or which one do you find the most important to reset your life and live the way you want to live. It's the question again about the reasoning. Do you believe that the truth is objective? And then why? Because all the science professors used to think that whatever we discover with the help of the methodology of science is the objective truth. The same about the civilization since the ancient times. the truth is objective due to some sort of values that we do not create. And as we began to recreate the concept of values to our use, we even began to recreate the concept of science. And that's the question. What will happen if we will pursue that way of thinking? What will happen if we pursue the way of thinking that we can create values that determine what is good and how we should reason in our life, and how the world will look if we start reasoning, if we can determine in science what is true or what is not without scientific proofs.
But, am I on?
Yes, you are.
But didn't scientists at one point think that the Earth was flat? I mean, science is kind of hypothesis. It's kind of like a guess. And then they disprove or prove it within the guess that they've made. It's a bit predictive. It's like, we're going to hypothesize this thing, and then if we've hypothesized this, does this work or not? And it's always being redefined. And recently there have been really interesting scientific discoveries. Someone was hooked up to it. This was in the news recently, although I know you guys are a bit skeptical of the news. But someone was hooked up to like an EKG machine to do some kind of monitoring for their epilepsy, and they happened to die at the time that they were hooked up to it. And so there was this very rare thing of someone being hooked up to, maybe it wasn't an EKG, something that monitors your brain, basically. And they discovered that after the guy died, the brain was still active for like a minute or 30 seconds, and it went into this very deep meditative state, which is the same kind of state you go into when you're dreaming and things like this. And this might be why when people have near-death experiences, they have their life flashing before their eyes as this kind of dream or whatever. We don't know, but the fact is it's redefining. They're going to do studies now about consciousness and what consciousness is and where it's located. And I mean, yeah, I just feel like there's always change in science as well. And it's also, science is like done by scientists, which are like humans who are very flawed and they don't know everything. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Great. I want to open it out to the audience again. So if there are any other questions or short thoughts, now's your chance. We have about 10, 15 minutes. 10 minutes. So any questions, any thoughts? No. Please raise your hands if you do have something, and I will definitely get back to you. So I think, you know, we are in this sort of really interesting point of, you know, there's a kind of sense of the idea of the failure of politicians, the failure of the modern state. You know, getting back to Russia and Putin, you know, he couches his language through this idea of a 19th century spirituality. The Russian Orthodox Church stands side by side with Putin when they talk about this holy war. You know, that Kiev is part of, well, Ukraine doesn't exist, and it's Russian, and Kiev is its holy state, it's Jerusalem almost. So we are seeing it through major politics, you know, where we actions are determining our fate, or possibly will determine our fate, both from Putin as well as former US President Trump, who some people in the sort of alt-right and the kind of religious right saw as a bit of a messiah, you know. So this kind of performance of these kind of world leaders as almost, you know, messianic presence. It's just a thought that I wanted to throw out there because, you know, we have spoken about Ukraine and we've spoken about Putin and Russia. But this anti-liberal, anti-secular, anti-reason, anti-rational thought seems to be also manifesting itself in world politics. What's your, any thoughts on that? That's my dominant question at the moment. Who would like to address that? JJ.
You know, there's a great etching by Francisco de Goya called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. And I think that's the kind of problem that we have at the moment. We have a situation where myth is starting to take over from reason. And that might not be such a big problem. I think it is a problem, but I think it's starting to touch on things like international politics in the way that I think, Manick, you're kind of hinting at. When people start to think more mythologically about their relationship to political systems than rationally. And I think there's an issue that's been brewing for a long time. The modern, as I say, the contemporary modern world doesn't, that was dominated by the big industrial societies, by the US, by the West. The values of that world don't seem to have very much to offer us, right? We've had 10, 15 years of economic crisis. We've had 20 or 30 years of on-off stagnation economically in the West. People don't seem very happy. Everything about Western culture is about mental illness and about trauma and about being a victim or feeling threatened by other people. There's a very, very serious crisis in social values and social relations in these societies that are supposedly as advanced as they appear. And so I think that I think we've got to a point where we've been sort of defeated in our politics in trying to deal with this, right? We've had 20 or 30 years where we don't seem to have made any kind of ability to progress socially. And I think that's kind of breeding a certain kind of pessimism, a very profound pessimism, which leads people to kind of withdraw into all kinds of much more kind of symbolic and mythical horizons, whether it's Trump conspiracists or even Vladimir Putin, if he's talking about going backward to some mythological version of the origins of the Russian state. Right? And this is quite a dangerous situation if world leaders are relying on myth rather than a rational appreciation of power or what their interests are, right? As nation states. But I think it's entirely predictable, because I think that as a society, Western societies and China and the other big advanced societies, as I say, just really don't know what they're for anymore. And I think when you give up knowing what you're for, if progress isn't something you can define, if values of what's good or bad as a society can't be defined, then I think what happens is you get a culture that starts to turn inwards. And people turn inwards, and they turn to whatever imaginative horizon they find for themselves, which is often very atomized, it's very disconnected. And this is why the internet has become such a powerful accelerator and amplifier of this. The internet simply feeds back to us our own anxieties and our own misgivings and paranoias. And it breeds this culture of disorientation and absence of meaning. Of course, the reactions to, just to conclude, are often going to be about trying to reclaim certainty, authority, and the hierarchical relationship to the state power. And those things are going to draw us in, because we're going to feel we are feeling already very confused and uncertain about where we relate to each other. I think that's going to be a serious problem and a threat, both politically and culturally. But I think unless we create a space to work out what we really do believe in as a culture collectively together, and what our values should be, and the values that we share, then we're going to see this more and more. And in terms of, and so the idea of the sacred, I actually agree with what Jan said in terms of the morality of what is sacred about human life. I think it's an important under-discussed issue. Giorgio Agamben, the great Italian philosopher, has been attacked viciously for saying that actually there might be something more than just surviving, in COVID, right? there's more to human life than just survival, has been his point. For that, he has been pilloried, right? He's been attacked from every side. So I think there is something that we need to think about in terms of what is sacred. I don't know necessarily is what Byzantia thinks of as sacred, but I think we need to come back to some notion of what human is valuable in human life and society.
Okay, thank you, JJ. We are approaching the last 3 minutes of our discussion, so I'm going to give everyone about up to a minute to express their final thoughts on any of the questions, any of the thoughts, disagreements, perhaps commonalities. I think what's been wonderful is that we are having a very nuanced debate about this. So I'm going to start with Byzantia, then Agnieszka, and then finally Jan.
Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. That's all I have to say. That's Jung.
That's Jung, yeah.
So people that have come back to the conversation, they know that I survived the terror attack in 2015. So I would say being near to death or being in a situation where there is war, where things become really clear and precise, you know what matters and you don't waste your time. You think about who you love and what you've done to show your love to them.
Thank you.
I would say something that Jordan Peterson used to say about what he learned from Jung. The fact that to live successfully with yourself, you need hierarchy of values. And at the top of that hierarchy is God. And it doesn't have to be a persona. And it doesn't have to be religious in any sort of way. But you have to understand what value defines the rest of it. What is the absolute? Because with such an understood God, the absolute value of the hierarchy of your values, you cannot act happily with yourself because you cannot distinguish what's good in the way you understand it good and what is bad for you and for your activity in the world.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to do my final thought is really looking at the I like to inhabit contradictions, and I'm maybe sitting on the fence on this. But you know, if I kind of think of someone like William Blake, great visionary, great poet, great mystical, great mystic actually, who also embraced a sense of radicalism. His belief in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, associating with great reasoned, enlightened thinkers like Thomas Paine. So I think we can find the third way through this, why it's neither one or the other. The dichotomies of the sacred and the profane feel like they are, in a sense, false dichotomies. Perhaps there is a syncretic approach to looking at the two areas. We need more from our politicians. Don't trust them, as I agree with Agnieszka on that. We cannot trust politicians. And particularly when they almost try and take on this sort of messianic performance, as we see with Putin and others. Those are my final thoughts. I thank all my amazing guests here. JJ, thank you. Suffering from COVID, but you spoke so eloquently and wonderfully over there, and
thank you.
Really appreciate your contribution to the discussion. Byzantia, I think as an artist, it was animistic, and I think you do open something within individuals. So I've had my cards read from you. I know other people who've really had some incredible insights into themselves and what's playing out in their lives. Agnieszka, my co-curator, it's been great to do this again with you, and I think that the film is as a kind of form of what's out there on the internet is a really important, interesting film, and we are going to be plotting the next few debates, which I'll mention before we finish. Jan, thank you so much for your, I think there's so many layers of thinking and thought, which was really important. I'd like to thank the directors of the Ujazdowski Castle. Ujazdowski, I will get it right sometime. Ujazdowski Castle Centre for Contemporary Art, particularly the directors, Piotr, and the deputy directors, Marcel Skierski, Beata Lupinska-Reitel. Thank you for allowing us to have this debate. I'd like to thank Anka Kobieska for getting us all here and booking us into a lovely hotel and sorting out all the logistics. I'd like to thank our wonderful translators who have done such incredible work to kind of translate these very kind of complex debates, and the technical team for, again, putting on the virtual presence as well as the presentations and the ambience of this wonderful auditorium. Our next discussion is going to be, we do pick hot controversial issues. It's on a woman's right to choose, and that's going to be quite you know, a lot to discuss, which probably develops from these this particular theme of the sacred and the profane. We're going to have Ella Whelan, who's a writer and co-convener of the Academy of Ideas. And the Academy of Ideas, we're very pleased to let you know that they are going to be one of our principal partners in some of the forthcoming debates. So they organise a fantastic festival called the Battle of Ideas in London, as well as across Europe. So we're very pleased with that new collaboration. Our second the other speakers are going to be the writer, philosopher, but also sort of surrealist, experimental writer, Nina Power. And Nina is an incredible writer and thinker, so looking forward to having her. And Claudia Clare is a ceramic artist, and she comes from a very strong tradition of more second-wave feminism, but her work, she works with a lot of women, vulnerable women, and so we are going to have, I hope, a nuanced debate. It's not going to be black and white. I think there's a lot of interesting thoughts around this subject. That's going to be on the 12th of May this year at the same time. So I do hope you can all come again. Thank you, everyone, and I hope I haven't missed any other people to thank. Come in 2 months' time. I look forward to seeing you. And everyone on Facebook Live and YouTube, thanks for tuning in. Thank you. Bye.